Everyone doing today? Welcome, welcome. Glad to be here. I hope that you're having a lovely Thursday. I am here and I am sitting here. I've got plenty of water to drink. That's unnamed 0-calorie diet water. And, it's Thursday afternoon, Thursday evening. I thought we would have a bit of a conversation. So welcome, glad you're here. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell so you find out the next time we're going to do one of these. People often are complaining they're not getting the notifications. So if you hit the notifications bell, you are more likely to find out when the next one of these is going to be. Furthermore, if you can post this on Facebook, post this on Reddit, post this on Twitter. The more people we can bring in, the more people that are here to have a lovely conversation with us, the more wide-ranging the conversation gets. So the more people here, the better. It should be fun. Should be great. I am sitting here. I am in my office, and I am delighted about the fact that tomorrow the restaurants of New York City are supposed to open. That'll be amazing. It'll be utterly amazing to be able to sit in a restaurant again. It will put a smile on my face. I'll be so happy about it. So fingers crossed they don't change their minds at the last minute. Hopefully restaurants open here in New York very soon. So the way we do things here is I give my opening remarks, and then I answer your super chat questions. I write them down as they roll on in. So, I guess with no further ado, I will jump into my opening remarks. Folks, CGTN, the Chinese TV network, has been banned in the United Kingdom. It was removed from the airwaves in the United Kingdom. So, in response to that, China removed BBC from their airwaves. Tit for tat, right? You ban our TV network in Britain, we ban your TV network in China. That's how these things work. But what blew my mind, just absolutely blew my mind, is that there were a number of outlets that reported on BBC being taken off the airwaves in China, but never bothered to mention that this was in response to CGTN being taken off the airwaves in the United Kingdom. And that just shows you how unbelievably deceptive and dishonest American media is. I saw outlets reporting on this as the evil Chinese communists banned British television because they're evil and because it's exposing, never mentioning that they weren't going to do anything to BBC until the British government took CGTN off the air. A couple super chats here. Let me write them down. Imagination about productive forces. All right, what's the next one here? Before I need a quick answer. What is the book you call about? The name is Nelson Peary. Nelson Peary, Black Bolshevik, or Black Radical. All right. So anyhow, and happy Chinese New Year to all those folks watching. Right-wing miss. This religion. And then on AOC. Alrighty. Just writing down your super chats. Like I said, we get to those in the second half. So, all these outlets are reporting on BBC being outlawed in China, never mentioning what happened first. Never mentioning it. And that really goes to show you how blatantly dishonest anti-communist propaganda can be. These folks have no interest in trying to tell the truth. If BBC were banned in China because the Chinese Communist Party were having a bad day, they would be right. They would be right to say that. But that's not what happened. This is tit for tat. And if you don't mention that Britain banned CGTN, but you just how do these people sleep at night? That's my question. How do these people pretend to be at all honest when you're reporting that China's banned BBC, but you fail to mention that the UK banned CGTN? I mean, how do these people sleep at night? Honestly, it's beyond me. It's really, really beyond me. It's really beyond me. And my head wants to just explode. Now, Myanmar, right? As I've discussed before, Myanmar, the military of Myanmar is very pro-China. The reason that the military of Myanmar is pro-China is because China goes to Myanmar and builds up their state sector, builds them railroads, builds them hospitals, builds them airports and power plants. And because of that, the military, which is very dominant in the economy of Myanmar, they're not communists, they're not socialists. They model themselves more on like the Asian tigers, like Singapore, etc. But China makes a better deal with them, and so the military has retaken the government of Myanmar. They overthrew the elected government. The military is in power. And so Joe Biden has declared that this was a coup, and as a result, $42 million in U.S. aid to Myanmar has been cut off. And basically, Myanmar is solidly in China's camp at this point. With the $42 million in U.S. aid cut off, basically, U.S. influence in Myanmar is done. Myanmar is solidly in China's camp. Now, there are a lot of factors about why this happened, but ultimately, at this point, the military of Myanmar is concerned about the danger of civil war and unrest among the Muslim community. The United States and China have escalated their tensions, and the Obama administration had been able to persuade Myanmar to have open elections, to allow a layer of pro-U.S. forces. And now that has been reversed. And the Biden administration has come out swinging against it. It's come out swinging against it. So, I wanted to comment on, when you saw Biden and Kamala Harris speaking at the Pentagon, other than, they did call it a coup in Myanmar. They did talk about an anti-China strategy. Biden claimed he had gotten a leader of opposition in Saudi Arabia freed from jail. But other than that, they said absolutely nothing. A lot of platitudes. A lot of we love the troops, we love the military. That was it. And that a lot of what the new administration in Washington, D.C. is doing is very, very neutral and bland. It's almost like they're afraid to take a solid stand. It's like they're testing the waters. It's like behind the scenes there are negotiations going on. It's very interesting. When Obama came in there, he was all about hope and change, a new day, and all of this. When Trump came in there, he was, America first, and, blah, blah, blah. The Biden administration is taking it very slow. They're taking it very, very, very slow. All right, now the move on Yemen, declaring the Ansar Allah group to no longer be terrorists, that's significant. Calling the coup in Myanmar a coup, that's significant. But other than that, the Biden administration is taking it very slow. And I assume that that is because of the fact that the Biden White House represents such a broad coalition of anti-Trump forces. And thank you, Red Cat, for your super chat. Such a broad coalition of anti-Trump forces that there is so much confusion within that camp that they don't really know exactly what they're going to do. Furthermore, there's a lot of instability, I think, in the country. And they don't want to take any dramatic moves that might, spark a dramatic response. They're reading the situation very, very carefully and trying to carefully maneuver about what moves they're going to take. It's very interesting. They're almost kind of frozen. They're afraid if they take the wrong move, things will escalate further. They're certainly playing up this impeachment of Donald Trump, and that seems to be a big part of the new administration and what they're doing. Trump was awful, the attack on the Capitol. Look, I've got to tell you, the Trump administration really handled their electoral defeat very, very badly. There are some decisions that will go down in history as bad decisions. I think about this a lot, right? So you got to think about, right, George Lucas took his idea for Star Wars to many different studios. Finally got 20th Century Fox to go with George Lucas. But I imagine that, there were a number of boardrooms of different studios that George Lucas walked into the room with Star Wars. And there was somebody in that room who said, "This is the craziest thing I ever heard. Are they in outer space or are they knights and castles? This doesn't make sense. And why are all the different planets, why do all the different planets have different climates? Many planets usually have more than one climate. So why do you have a desert planet and a snow planet? Get out of here. This will never go anywhere. Star Wars, get out of here." Well, that guy feels pretty stupid now, doesn't he? J.K. Rowling. She took her Harry Potter book to many different publishers. And you can be sure there's a corporate boardroom, they're sitting there and it's like, what? Normal children turning into wizards? Muggles? What's a muggle? This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. No one will ever read Harry Potter. This is dumb. Oh, get this out of here. And that guy's feeling pretty stupid. I should have done a British accent, right? Muggles? What's a muggle? This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Get this out of here. Get out of here. Get out of here, Miss J.K. Rowling. I don't want to hear any of this Harry Potter nonsense. Right? There you go. It was a British publishing house. Right? Meanwhile, so those are people that rejected ideas that turned out to be pretty good ideas. But then there's also people, who had very bad ideas themselves. Like when the Titanic hit an iceberg. The Titanic hit an iceberg. The captain probably got his crew together and said, what should we do? Should we evacuate the ship? And there was a guy who said, no, we're not going to evacuate the ship. This is the Titanic. It'll never sink. I mean, look how big the ship is. Oh, this will never happen. Yeah, look how well that turned out. So that leads me to believe that on election night, Donald Trump gathered his supporters in a room, gathered his inner circle of strategists in a room. And he said to them, guys, we lost this one. What do we do? And one guy raised his hand and he said, I got a brilliant idea. And he said, all right, let's hear it. He said, we say we didn't. And he's like, what do you mean we say we didn't? No, we say we didn't. Donald Trump is, what do you mean we say we didn't? We can't just say we didn't win the election. What are you talking about? This is dumb. What are we talking about? And the guy says, well, we'll just say we didn't lose the election. We'll just declare that we actually won the election. And he's like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You can't just say we won the election. Get out of here. I want to hear another idea. And the guy raised his hand and he said, but Trump, you haven't heard the best part. He says, the best part? What could possibly be good about this plan to just say we didn't lose when we lost? The guy says, on the day that Congress is going to certify the election results, we get a group of crazy rednecks to run through the halls of Congress. And we have one of them put a buffalo hat on his head, and we have a bunch of other people wave Confederate flags, and they run through the halls of Congress and break some windows and act completely crazy. And then Donald Trump sat there and go, that guy's on to something. I like this. I like this. Yeah, that's a surefire plan. Yeah, no, what are they going to do? I mean, it's definitely going to work. Oh, boy. Oh, boy. What a world. What a world. But here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Someone's in the chat saying that they doubt Trump is actually that rational. But I don't know. I don't know. Folks, there is a pipeline, a natural gas pipeline that connects Russia to Germany. It's called Nord Stream 2. And Russia, with its economy centered around oil and natural gas, the state-run natural gas company of Russia is called Gazprom. Gazprom is going to sell natural gas to Germany. And the U.S. Wall Street imperialists are furious about this. They can't stand this. And they have put sanctions on Germany. And they are doing everything they can to try and twist the arm of Germany, to force the Germans to buy their natural gas from Wall Street and fracking companies. And if you look at a map, Germany and Russia are pretty darn close to each other. The United States and Russia are not very close to each other. The notion that Germany should buy its natural gas from the United States is so economically ridiculous when they can just buy it from Russia right over their border. It does not make any logical sense. But this is what the leaders of the United States are basically demanding and trying to do everything possible to make happen. They really desperately want to force Russia, or to force Germany not to buy Russia's natural gas. It's really ridiculous, but if you can understand what's happening here, you can understand what imperialism is all about. Imperialism is a global economic system where a few banks and corporations based in Western countries dominate the global economy. You'll notice that in the 1990s, the United States and Russia got along very, very well. Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin were very good friends. Why? Because during the 1990s, Russia's economy was in the free fall. It was completely falling apart economically. It was not making its own steel anymore. It wasn't making its own metal anymore. It wasn't making its own food anymore. It was importing its food. Russia's economy collapsed. The factories shut their doors. The farms shut down. Mass unemployment, mass starvation, mass hunger. And at that point, the United States and Russia got along very well because Russia was a captive market. It was a client state. It was not a competitor. It was impoverished, and it was an impoverished captive market. But when Putin came into power and restructured Russia's economy around oil and natural gas, and when Russia's industrial base reasserted itself, when Russia's economy started to rise, when Russia started exporting oil and gas on the international markets, when Russia became a competitor with Wall Street, suddenly you'll notice that once again Russia became somebody that was demonized by the United States. This is the nature of imperialism. Imperialism is about profits. It is about making sure that no stable competitor emerges. Before the Chinese Revolution of 1949, China was a deeply impoverished country. There was mass famines all the time in which all kinds of people died. And at that point, the United States was quite happy with China. But when China broke free and started making its own steel and started building up its own industries, China very much became a competitor with the United States. And now, when China has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, When China makes half the steel in the world, now the U.S. imperialists see China as an enemy. They don't want any competitors. They want to dominate the world market. They want the whole world poor, and they want the whole world dependent on them. They want the whole world to have to buy their products. They want the whole world to be impoverished. They want the world as one big, impoverished, captive market. That is what imperialism is. Imperialism is a system of global monopoly capitalism, where Wall Street and London make the world poor so that they can stay rich. That is the nature of imperialism. Imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is not a synonym for war. Imperialism is not a synonym for invading a country. Imperialism is an economic order. Lenin described it in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He laid out 5 points of what imperialism is. Finance capital, becoming dominant over industrial capital, the creation of giant international cartels, the carving out of developing countries as spheres of influence, the export of capital. This is the nature of what imperialism is. And the reason that Russia and China and Venezuela and Iran and Cuba and Vietnam are hated by the imperialists is because they have broken out of that system. They are no longer impoverished client states. They have broken free. That is why they hate these countries. All right. Japan. Predators. That's why they hate these countries. Furthermore, at one point, you could argue that this global setup of imperialism benefited the United States. You know, average Americans, they had a decent life. A house and a car. You know, white Americans, that white, cushy middle class of well-paid industrial workers, 1950s, auto workers, steel workers, meat packers in the United States. There was a layer of workers in the United States that were well-paid enough that they enjoyed a comfortable life and they benefited from imperialism. That's called the aristocracy of labor. And Lenin wrote about this, right? That part of what imperialism does is it stabilizes the imperialist centers, the homelands, by cultivating a layer of working class people in the homeland who get some of the crumbs from what the imperialists carve out of the rest of the world. And because of that, they are loyal to empire. And because of that, there are divisions in the working class at the homeland. There is stratification of the working class in the homeland. But what we are seeing now is the demolition of the aristocracy of labor. The aristocracy of labor is being demolished. The good-paying industrial jobs are gone. The suburban neighborhoods are full of empty foreclosed homes and opioid addiction and suicide. The children of that layer of well-paid industrial workers are stuck in a lifetime of low-wage, short-term service sector jobs. The roads in the working class neighborhoods that were once prosperous are now unpaved and crumbling. The water is not being purified, and the imperialist homelands are being demolished. Cuba forms. That is the defining aspect of the period we are living in. The leveling of the first world. What the imperialists have done to so many countries around the world, they are now doing to many big sectors of the imperialist homeland. We are witnessing a transition in the global economy, away from the setup of imperialist countries and developing countries, and a transition toward a stage in which you have a multinational bourgeoisie impoverishing and destabilizing the first world. At the same time, they are impoverishing and destabilizing the third world. They are dissolving the first world into a global, open international system, so that a small group of bankers and monopolists in London and in Wall Street can enrich themselves at the expense of the entire world. We are living in a very, very critical moment. The first world resurrect the labor aristocracy. Labor aristocracy. And so the work that we do in this critical moment is vitally important. The work that we do is vitally important. Let me repeat that. The work that we do now is vitally important. Folks, the door doesn't open very often. There were people in the 1960s who really believed that capitalism was going to have its last breath, that they were going to lead the revolution, and they were wrong. The U.S. working class wasn't having it. The black community was revolutionary in the 1960s and 70s, for sure. The African-American community was revolutionary, anti-imperialist, and ready to fight. A lot of college students, young people who didn't want to fight in Vietnam, they were revolutionary. But most average Americans looked at the anti-war protesters and the people marching in the streets and said, what those kids need is a good spanking and a haircut. Average Americans didn't want to hear it in the 1960s. They didn't want to hear it. There was a hit song, Proud to be an Okie from Muskogee. And Nixon rode to power with his silent majority because most average Americans, because the economy was still booming, because the aristocracy of labor was still cemented, most average Americans were not revolutionary. In the 1930s, many people in the 1930s believed that they were living in the final period of capitalism. There was a huge labor movement. The Communist Party had tens of thousands of members and got hundreds of thousands of votes in some elections. The Soviet Union was aligned with the United States against fascism. But racism was a big factor. Racism was a big factor in the United States at that point. Jim Crow segregation still existed in the United States. Furthermore, World War II broke out. And coming out of World War II, you're very welcome, Ahmad. Coming out of World War II, the United States suddenly had a booming economy, and the potential of revolution, the revolutionary core that had centered around the Roosevelt coalition and the Communist Party was broken up with McCarthyism. So there wasn't a socialist or communist revolution in the 1930s, and there wasn't a socialist or communist revolution in the 1960s. But I'm telling you that the way things are going in the United States right now, we are heading towards a crisis in which a revolution, and I don't mean a civil war, I don't mean violence, I mean the transition of the United States to a rational, centrally planned economy. The dismantling of imperialism, a new economic order, a government of action for working families. We are heading toward a situation where such a thing could definitely occur. Socialism and anti-imperialism is rising around the world, centered around China. Capitalism has created a situation where there's going to be millions and millions of unemployed people, The reserve army of labor that Marx wrote about, of workers who cannot find employment, is expanding and expanding because of artificial intelligence and the computer revolution. The capitalists are fighting amongst each other and desperately recruiting workers to be their foot soldiers in fights among themselves as they scramble to try and keep order within the imperialist homelands. The door is opening. And these doors don't stay open very long. They don't stay open for very long. The moment is arising on which the United States could head to a revolutionary situation, and we could finally see a way out of the chaos created by the greed of billionaires and bankers. We could see an end to these criminal wars. We could see an end to the racism and horrific conditions facing so many communities in the United States. We could see the dismantling of a global financial empire and the resurrection of the United States on completely new foundations. We could see a society where the people's needs come first, and where the American people, black, white, Latino, Asian, Arab, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, stand arm in arm with the people of the world. And together, the United States and the rest of humanity are reborn. Socialism could very well be on the horizon. However, what we do in these times is vitally important. And that is why I don't go along with the crowd. That is why I insist on saying things that people do not want to hear. That is why I beat the drum. That's why I criticize socialists in the United States. Because I know how vital the moments we are living in are. We are living in the last days of American capitalism. These are the last days. These are the last days. But if we sit here and let the moment pass, if we do not take seriously the responsibility that has been placed into our hands, if we act childishly and frivolously, then we will lose one of the greatest opportunities that history has ever handed us. And we will bring in a future that will be far worse for humanity. I've pointed out many times before, folks, the fall of Rome, the fall of the Roman Empire, was not a good thing. I don't like the Roman Empire. I consider the Roman Empire to have been a historical abomination. Absolutely. The Roman Empire was a nightmare. But when the Roman Empire fell, what was the result? The result was the average height of a human being decreasing by 4 or 5 inches. The result was the life expectancy of human beings throughout Europe and the Mediterranean going down by decades. The result of the fall of the Roman Empire was Europe having its population significantly decrease. It took 1,100 years for Europe to regain the population it had at the height of the Roman Empire. And why was the collapse of Rome followed by such great reductions in living standards and life expectancies and stability in population? Because the Roman Empire, it was not followed up by something more progressive. Rome was an abomination. But what replaced Rome was hundreds of years of instability, hundreds of years of chaos, hundreds of years of reactionary, predatory. Rome was not replaced with something progressive. Rome disintegrated into barbarism. Rome did not rise up in revolution and build a higher system. No. The Roman Empire disintegrated in its own weight and fell into barbarism. This is where Rosa Luxemburg, the great revolutionary of German history, she wrote that the choice is socialism or barbarism. When you have an advanced civilization and it faces a crisis, and that civilization is no longer sustainable, it can either have a dramatic advance and get to a higher stage, or it can disintegrate into a lower stage. And that is why Rosa Luxemburg raised the slogan, socialism or barbarism, because that is ultimately the future of the West. Western civilization, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, we are facing the choice of socialism or barbarism. There will not be a continuing status quo. The status quo is crumbling before our very eyes. The computer revolution has made the labor aristocracy unsustainable. The rise of China and the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasian alternative has made global hegemony for Western corporations no longer possible and sustainable. So will the United States awaken and get beyond its reactionary nature? Or will the United States simply continue to deteriorate further into barbarism? That is really the question before us. And that is why I will continue to say things that are not pleasant for people to hear. I am going to be relentless in my criticism, because I am going to do my best to make sure that we don't get barbarism out of this crisis, that we get a socialist America. We get the dismantling of imperialism. We get a new global civilization based on brotherhood and sisterhood and solidarity with all mankind. So let's talk about a few things that people don't want to hear. Number one, cancel culture is real. Cancel culture is absolutely real. It is not fake. It's not something that right-wingers made up. There is such a thing as cancel culture. And I have been a victim of it myself. Everywhere I go on the internet, you post one of my videos on a web forum, immediately there will be 3 people below it denouncing me and saying that I'm actually a Nazis, Nazi, white supremacist, which is ridiculous. I've spent years as an anti-racist. Long before Black Lives Matter had ever been hashtag tweeted, I was going to court with police brutality victims, but it doesn't matter to these folks. Cancel culture is absolutely real, and it didn't start with the so-called left. It actually started with the right wing. The beginning of modern cancel culture started with David Horowitz. David Horowitz, the neoconservative, launched cancel culture campaigns on America's college campuses. Fox News and David Horowitz, they went after Professor Ward Churchill, the Native American Studies professor, and they launched a whole campaign to try and suppress professors who were anti-war. They would accuse a professor of being anti-American or against our troops, and they would whip up a hysterical Fox News campaign against a teacher, against a professor, and it was the exact same strategy. Make them famous. And some teacher, some high school teacher in Illinois, or, somebody that catch them on tape saying that America has committed crimes and committed coups. The cancel culture stuff started with David Horowitz. and it was about silencing critics of U.S. foreign policy. And it was Fox News and Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity who waged it. It was about far-left voices that are anti-American, and it was a way to try and shut down the anti-war sentiments on college campuses in the United States. They didn't have Facebook and Twitter to do it. They had Fox News to do it. It was a very similar campaign. And they waged it against Grover Furr. Grover Furr was targeted, a professor who's written a lot about the history of the Soviet Union. They did it against all kinds of college professors. They set up a website, Discover the Networks, and it was all about how do we dox and humiliate and threaten and whip up public hysteria against any teacher or professor who dares engage in anti-imperialism and dares teach their students about the real history of American empire. So the same voices started it. And now the more liberal wing seems to be advocating that and doing exactly that. The hysteria at this point, now it tends to target also people that are critical of American foreign policy. Just so happens that, unfortunately, most criticism of U.S. foreign policy is coming from the right. Not always, right? Tulsi Gabbard, Congresswoman from Hawaii, she's on the left, but she gets called Nazbol and fascist, right? Jimmy Dore. The cancel culture stuff is very, very real. And what it is about purging any voice that is critical of American imperialism. That's really what it's about. It used to be they tried to, under David Horowitz, Fox News, they presented you as a supporter of the Taliban, as a terrorist, as a Muslim terrorist, anti-American. That was the way it started. Now they say you're a transphobe, or a homophobe, or a racist, or a sexist, or a Nazbol, or a white supremacist, Strasserite. But it's the same ultimate campaign. It's about shutting down any criticism of U.S. foreign policy. You can be on the left, as long as being on the left means voting for Biden and wanting to overthrow the government of Russia and China. As long as being left means that you support U.S. foreign policy and that we should be sending more soldiers to Syria to topple evil Assad because evil Assad is racist, sexist, and homophobic or whatever. Right? As long as being a leftist means that you're a supporter of empire, that you're fine. But if your leftism sticks to opposing American imperialism and opposing empire, and daring ask questions about their narratives, they will silence you. And they use the exact same words that David Horowitz used against anti-war college professors are being used now against anti-imperialist leftists. Cancel culture is a reality. And there is only one way to defeat cancel culture. There is only one way to defeat cancel culture. There is only one way to defeat cancel culture. And I know this is not what you want to hear, but I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I'm here to tell you what you need to hear. The only way to defeat cancel culture is to get stronger. Let me repeat this. The only way to defeat cancel culture is to get stronger. If you can't get strong, if you cannot learn to withstand, then you will never defeat cancel culture. The way cancel culture works is with intimidation. Intimidation. Oh, you were watching Caleb's stream. Well, Caleb's a fascist. I mean, I'm not, but so you must be a fascist. You better tweet out that you're never going to watch Caleb's stream again because, or else I'll cancel you as a fascist. Right? right? You're watching Jimmy Dore. You're sharing Jimmy Dore's video. Don't you know Jimmy Dore is a fascist? So if you don't denounce Jimmy Dore right now, if you don't apologize for watching his stream, then you must be a fascist. The only way to defeat it is for people like you. When someone comes to you and says, Jimmy Dore is fascist, you should apologize for watching Jimmy Dore. You say, Jimmy Dore is not fascist. Shut up. When people come to you and say, oh, don't watch Caleb. Caleb's fascist. You say, Caleb's not a fascist. Shut up. When someone comes to you and says, don't watch Convo Couch. Don't you know that they made fun of AOC one time? They're Nazis. You got to say, Convo Couch are not fascists. Shut up. Strength, courage, refusing to be intimidated is the only way cancel culture will be defeated. You can say, I don't agree with Jimmy Dore. I don't agree with Convo Couch. I don't agree with Caleb. But I'm not going to be intimidated by this campaign. I am going to listen to people, whether you, the mob, say I'm allowed to or not. Another super chat there. Meeting of Vietnamese communists posted by Luna Oi. Polybation celebrating. Imagine that. All right, definitely we'll talk about that. Vietnamese communists. Folks, there's another YouTuber who's been widely subject to hate. Angie Speaks. And she tweeted out today that one of the big problems in left-wing circles is that there seems to be a celebration of weakness and vulnerability and fragility. People are encouraged to look vulnerable, to look weak, to present themselves as victims. That's a big problem. Because in the real world, people don't really respect that. And all the great communist leaders have been leaders who projected strength, not weakness. What does Stalin mean in Russian? Do you know what it means? It means man of steel. Look at Fidel Castro. Look at Che Guevara. These were not people who got attention by looking like victims. These were not people who if they were told not to watch someone's YouTube videos would go, oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I ever watched their YouTube videos. No. The only way to defeat cancel culture is for you to learn to be strong. I've talked many times about over-socialization. I've talked many, many times about how social media makes us weaker. It manipulates us. It appeals to the part of our minds that demand the approval of others. We must learn to be strong. But strength doesn't mean you don't have compassion. Strength doesn't mean that you're a bully. Strength doesn't mean that you're cruel. No. The right, Ayn Rand, libertarianism, Trumpism, they put forward a strength that is toxic because it is a strength that it is stripped of humanity. It is a strength that is stripped of kindness. It is a strength that is stripped of the ability to love. It is an indifference to others. It is an overconfidence and a boastfulness. It is a glorification of cruelty and sadism. And while we must reject the left's over-celebration of victimhood. We must also reject the right and their radical individualism and their bullying and their lack of empathy. Folks, if you want to know, this may sound completely silly. This may absolutely sound like the stupidest thing you ever heard, but sometimes you have to use popular culture examples. If you want to know the ideal personality for a communist, go read a Superman comic book. Go read a 1930s, 1940s Superman comic book. Or go watch the old Christopher Reeve Superman. Superman, the comic book from the 1930s, put forward the personality of a progressive-minded Rooseveltian. Right? Think about the character of Superman. Superman has awesome powers and strength. If he wanted to, he could rule over the entire world, but he doesn't. Instead, he lives a humble life as a mild-mannered reporter. And no one can tell it's him because he has those glasses on, and it's just like the perfect disguise. Superman is very strong and powerful, but he hates violence. He hates violence. Superman is a small-town guy from Smallville, Kansas. He's got nice, wholesome, adoptive parents. Grew up on a farm. And Superman hates racism with every bone in his body. You would look at an old 1930s, 1940s comic book. Superman fights the Ku Klux Klan at a time when they still had separate drinking fountains in the United States for African Americans, and the Ku Klux Klan had millions of members. If you look at an old 1930s comic book, Superman fought against the Ku Klux Klan. Superman told American workers not to hate immigrants, not to hate black people, not to engage in bigotry. Superman loved labor unions. In fact, the first comic book of Superman was to rescue a group of coal miners who were on strike, and their boss was trying to kill them. And Superman flew in to rescue the coal miners. And who does Superman go after, right? He fights crime. He fights crime. But does Superman go after, some low-income person who's breaking into a store to steal a couple bucks? No. Does he go after, a working-class mother who shoplifts food for her kids? No. Superman's arch nemesis is Lex Luthor, a billionaire capitalist who's using technology to rule over the people. A maniacally evil bald man in a white coat who sees the people of Metropolis as mere financial calculations. Lex Luthor is a Silicon Valley fascist. Lex Luthor is Jeff Bezos. Lex Luthor is Bill Gates. Lex Luthor is Anton LaVey. He says, man is just another animal. Human beings are cattle, and I am the cattle master. And I will breed them and control them to enrich myself. And I will use my technological empire to ruthlessly exploit people and enhance my own profits at the expense of everyone else. And Superman sees Superman very much sees that the most dangerous criminals don't rob people on the street. They rob people in corporate boardrooms. The most dangerous murderers don't murder people in a fight or murder people in a fit of passion. They murder people with cold, calculated indifference in the pursuit of their own profits. Superman is a progressive. Superman is compassionate. He's fair-minded. He's optimistic. And he's patriotic. He talks about truth, justice, and the American way. But at the end of the day, Superman is motivated by love. Love and kindness. Folks, the first Superman comic was published in 1939. And the fact that Superman was known as the Man of Steel was not an accident. At the time those comics were published, everybody knew that Man of Steel was the name of a well-known world leader. And the authors of the Superman comics were big fans of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they were big enemies of fascism. Superman is very much a creation of the popular front. Superman is a relic of a mass progressive movement in the United States centered around the Communist Party that has had a lasting impact on the world. Superman comes out of the same era that Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger's music comes out of. Superman comes out of the same time that the writings of John Steinbeck come out of. Superman is progressive modernity. And if you can think about Superman, the powerful, strong, yet optimistic and loving and compassionate person, you can think about Superman as the ideal for how a leftist should present themselves. We'll be getting to where we need to go. We need to reinvent leftism in the United States. We need to reinvent American socialism. We need a constructive socialism to save America from the crisis of capitalism. That's what we need. We need to save socialism so that socialism can save America. And I think we can do it. I'm quite optimistic. I've got big plans for the Center for Political Innovation. Folks, we need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need America's working people to realize that the only hope for getting out of this nightmare is to build a society where the banks and the factories and the major centers of economic power are controlled by the people, and popular power controls the means of production. We need a new society, and we are living in the last days of American capitalism. But it's up to us to make sure that when the door opens, we walk through it. Our work is cut out for us, folks. It's now or never. And that concludes my opening remarks. So, on that note, I'll make sure I'm seeing all the super chats here, or the regular chats. Names and locations explain the party being the advanced detachment of the working class. Party, advanced detachment. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Oz Whistles in Australia. Kendall in San Diego. Belize Joey, Northern California, JT24. Thank you, Jenny Lynn, for the compliment. Washington State, Oshkosh, Wisconsin, Northern Virginia, Giles in Belgium, Gateshead, England, Cincinnati, Ohio, Mom's Basement, New Jersey, Swiss Man of Steel, Nassau County, Cincinnati, Ohio, Albany, New York, Liverpool, Toronto, Canada, St. David's, Bermuda, Balthazar in Oakland, California, San Jose, Fairhope, Alabama, Pennsylvania, USA, Santiago, Chile, Boston, Kathy Worth, John in Houston, Auckland, New Zealand, Bulgaria, Michigan, Teresa, very good, Big Al in Winchester, New York, Northwest Indiana, Chris Tuan, Pomona, California, New York City, Chris in Salt Lake City, Bay Area, California, Tyler Courtney. How and why was Henry Wallace replaced? All right. Henry Wallace. Detroit, Kansas City, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Jersey City, New York. I'm here, says Kinky, Atlanta, USA, Wembley, Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Very good. Fresno, California. Nashville, Tennessee. Rose Window. Very, 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 very good. Who else is with us tonight? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Tim Stacy in Kentucky. Leipzig, East Germany. And remember in Dallas, Texas. Kieran from San Diego. Bay Area, California. Suleiman. My cat is sleeping next to me, says the red cat. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Juan from Mexico. Welcome, Juan. Atlanta, very good, very, very, very good. East Germany, red cat, very good, very, very good. Anybody else? Anybody else? Names and locations. Billings, Montana is with us, very good. Glad you're with us in Billings, Montana. Very good. Who else is with us tonight? Anyone else? Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Argentina, Spain, Julian in Sussex, UK, Denver, Colorado. Very, very good. Julian from Texas. Very, very good. Very, very, very good. Anyone else with us tonight? Seattle. Very, very good. I saw the Henry Wallace Super Chat, wrote it down. Brian Schaefer in Illinois is with us. Very good, Brian. Glad you are with us. Glad you're here. Very good. All right, so now we'll start going through these Super Chat questions. But before we do that, folks, let me ask you vehemently, please, 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 please tweet this out. Please, please, please post this on your Facebook. People have not been getting the notifications. I don't know why that's happening, but for some reason, people continue to tell me they don't receive the notifications. So be sure to hit the notifications bell. Be sure to list it as giving you all notifications because people are not getting the notifications. So I'm begging you to please make sure you're subscribed, make sure you hit the notifications bell, but also do your part. Promote this, share this around. The more people that see this, the better. The bigger the conversation is, the better. Do your part. Let's build this community. We don't know how much longer we'll be here on YouTube, but we're going to be here. I mean, we're gonna keep going. So please post this around. Please hit the notifications bell. Please share this. Yeah, please do. Please do. The more people that see this, the better. We want to keep rolling on ahead. All right. So keep the super chats rolling in. I will answer them as they come in. All right. Someone asked about lack of imagination about productive forces. This is a problem. The idea, look, I'll answer this the way I always answer this, right? So right now there are a lot of people who really strongly believe that there are just not enough resources. And that the human race needs to stop expanding, that we just, human beings have too much stuff, and growth is no longer sustainable. Growth is bad. And if you look at the way these people frame their arguments, there are some fundamental flaws in what they are saying. For example, there's a book that was published by the Club of Rome. It was published in the 1970s, and it was called The Limits to Growth. And they basically argued that the human population is too big, that economic growth cannot continue, and that we would run out of oil in the 1990s at some point. And here's the thing. If we were currently extracting and producing oil the same way that we extracted and produced oil when that book was published, they would be correct, right? If we were getting oil the same way we got it in the 70s, we would have run out by now, except we didn't. Deep sea drilling has expanded, hydraulic fracking has expanded, and we have not run out. We have not run out. We have not run out of oil. Now, I think that oil is a very inefficient mode, and I think we need to get off of fossil fuels. But what that book failed to take into account was human innovation. At the time that book was published, there were minerals that were completely and utterly worthless. But now, these minerals are very, very valuable. Why? They're used in computer chips. Folks, human beings are constantly changing the way they interact with their resources. What would a caveman have done with oil? Right? You've probably seen the old TV show, The Beverly Hillbillies. You ever see The Beverly Hillbillies? Let me tell you all a story about a boy named Jed. And it's like, black gold Texas tea, right? His hunting rifle, he discovers oil. Right? And of course he shouts, "I'm rich, I've got oil." What if Joe the caveman, living 9,000 years ago, had discovered oil? He'd been out hunting with his pointed stick, and he discovered oil. He would have said, "That's completely worthless." It would have had no value to him whatsoever. In fact, if Joe the caveman had discovered a whole bunch of gold, he probably would have thought it was very nice to look at. It was shiny, but it wouldn't have done much good for Joe the caveman. The reason that gold has value, the reason that oil has value, is because the way we interact with our environment as human beings has changed. The entire history of the human race is changing the way we interact with resources. If human beings stop changing the way they interact with resources, we're screwed. If we don't change the way we interact with fossil fuels right now, we're screwed. Look at the environment right now. We have to get off of fossil fuels. They're right when they say that climate change is affected by human behavior. They're right when they say that oil-based economy is not sustainable. They are absolutely right. Absolutely right. What they're wrong about is when they lack imagination. When it doesn't occur to them that just like oil was worthless to Joe the caveman, there are things in our world now that seem worthless that we could figure out as human beings how to use them. Furthermore, we've sent probes to Mars. We've sent satellites into outer space. China is already extracting helium-3 from the moon for their research on fusion energy. Did you know that? Helium-3, an element that is very rare on the Earth, is very abundant on the far side of the moon. And China has already sent their lunar spacecraft to extract helium-3 from the moon. Imagine if we could start mining asteroids. The New York Times had an article about this. Imagine if every time an asteroid passed the Earth, we managed to send up a probe that went to that asteroid and took very valuable resources off that asteroid. Think about it. Asteroids pass the Earth all the time. And if every time one of those asteroids passed the Earth, we sent up a probe or a satellite that went onto the asteroid, extracted some resources, and brought it back to the planet, that would be great. Think about it. Think about it. Who's to say we can't start extracting resources from Mars? Who's to say we can't extract resources from other parts of the galaxy? Human beings are relentlessly creative. They are constantly changing the way they interact with the environment. If there's one thing about human beings that for the last 8,000 years, we have been changing the way we interact with our environment. We are the only animal that has the ability to make the environment serve us. Every other species interacts with their environment in a more or less neutral way. But humanity is not an animal. Beavers have been building their dams the same way for millions of years. Ants have been building their ant colonies the same way for millions of years. But in just less than 10,000 years, human beings have gone from hunter-gatherer tribes living in caves to space travel, iPhones, high-speed railway. I believe in humanity. The human race has the ability to advance. And if you stop believing in humanity, at that point, I can understand why people are turning to drug addiction. I can understand why people are getting suicidal. If you believe that humanity can't advance and that we must stop advancing, I can understand why you're in a state of pessimism and hopelessness. The people who think humanity can't advance have names like Rockefeller and DuPont and Carnegie. And you know why they think humanity can't advance? Because they're at the top of the mountain. Global capitalism is like that game that kids play, King of the Mountain. You ever see King of the Mountain? Those kids are trying to get to the top of the mountain. What has happened is that Rockefeller and Carnegie and DuPont and Rothschild and Vanderbilt and Mellon have gotten to the top of the mountain. They've wrestled their way to the top of the mountain. They've killed a lot of people to get to the top of the mountain. They have ruthlessly gotten to the top of the mountain. And now that they're at the top of the mountain, they are declaring, game over. Nope, we got to stop playing. We got to stop playing the game now. We're at the top of the mountain. The game's over. Now, it's been fun, folks. I had a great time, but we won the game. Game over. We're at the top of the mountain. That is exactly what they're doing. They're at the top of the mountain, and so now they're saying, well, for the sake of the environment, for the sake of Mother Earth, game over, guys. It was fun, wasn't it? Great, great. And of course, that's why the fracking companies deny global warming, because they want to be at the top of the mountain. Right? That's why a lot of these low-level capitalists, My Pillow, Mark Lindell, that's why they deny global warming. That's why they are so full of anger right now, is that they're competing with Mellon and Carnegie and DuPont. And they want to get to the top of the mountain. Well, I'm here to say that yes, we have some big problems. But the answer is not to end human progress. The answer is not to end human history. In fact, it's the opposite. The answer is to go further ahead. The answer is to get beyond fossil fuels. The answer is to get beyond the fuel sources that are destroying our environment. The answer is to find other sources of energy. The answer is to find other sources of resources. The answer is progress. The answer is progress. The answer is progress. And obviously we are in a crisis. We are definitely in a crisis. the way out is forward, not backward. You know? I'm trying to think of a good analogy. But there are many analogies I could make, but ultimately, the answer is progress. The answer is human progress. Human beings are quite an amazing species. We are quite an amazing species. And we will continue to advance. And trying to stop human beings from advancing is a pretty failed mission. In fact, rather than thinking of an analogy, here's a tangent I'll go on. It actually ties into the next super chat, myths that communism is anti-religion. We'll get to that, but actually, why don't I point you all toward a very common legend, the story of Adam and Eve. Right? The creation story that is popular in religion. It actually fits in quite well with everything I just said about human progress. Right? We know the story that there was this garden, this magical garden, in which human beings had everything they needed. They had everything they needed, but they were told that there was a certain tree, and that tree was the tree of knowledge. And they could not eat from that tree, for if they ate from that tree, they would die. But the story goes, the snake showed up and convinced Eve to eat from the tree. She liked it. She ate from the tree. She went over to Adam, convinced him to eat from the tree. And they ate from the tree, and they were then cast out of the garden. And when they were cast out of the garden, the story goes, suddenly they had to grow their own food. And that story is actually a very good analogy for the birth of human civilization. When we were hunters and gatherers, everything was there for us. We killed animals. The animals, we killed them. We had fruits and things to eat. We didn't have to grow our own food. But then at some point, thousands of years ago, human beings acquired knowledge. Something changed in our brains. We went from being animals to being humans. We somehow acquired knowledge. And once we acquired knowledge, we got way too good at gathering fruits and nuts. We got way too good at killing animals. We developed spears. We figured out patterns in animal herds. I mean, we knew, and we got really good. Thank you, Teresa. We got really good, very good at hunting and gathering. So good at it that there was a scarcity of fruits and nuts. There was a scarcity of animals. And suddenly, we had to grow our own food. We acquired knowledge. And as a result of acquiring knowledge, we had to grow our own food. We were no longer able to live in the balance of the garden. The garden, we are told, everything was in balance, according to the legend. Right? Everything was in balance. Everything was in balance, right? They never ran out of fruits and nuts, never ran out of animals, human beings and animals, and everything was frozen in the garden. But it was when we acquired knowledge that we were kicked out of the garden. It's funny that this fairy tale, this fable, that it actually has some rather interesting parallels to the historical materialist understanding of human civilization. That we once lived in a world of great abundance, but somehow we acquired knowledge. We acquired the ability to be progressive. We acquired the ability to advance. And once we acquired this ability to advance, suddenly we were cast out of perfectly being in balance with nature. And the legend continues that, according to the Christian narrative, after thousands of years and struggling with good and evil, eventually Eden is restored. That is the Christian narrative, right? That after thousands of years of struggling with good and evil, there will be a gigantic battle against some kind of empire that rules the entire world. Then afterwards, Eden will be restored, and that state of plentiful abundance will be restored. Well, Marxism has the exact same narrative. It argues that yes, class society came out of the society of great abundance, and we continue to advance, and through the class struggle, eventually we will get back to that state of abundance, from each according to their own ability, to each according to their need. We will get back to that state of no longer being in economic want. We will be back into the balance that we were in at the beginning. The historical materialist narrative and the Christian narrative are actually quite similar to each other. But if you look at the legends and myths about many societies in history, there are many, many similar stories. You look at the Greek mythology, you look at Roman mythology. Yes, the characters are different. Yes, the messages are different. But ultimately, this narrative that humans were in a state of perfection, gained their knowledge, and had a fall from grace, a fall, and then we will go through thousands of years of trials and tribulations and some kind of world empire coming into existence, and that empire falling in some kind of epic battle. And then we will once again be restored to that state of prosperity. That is the narrative of human history that you will find in almost every society. It's actually interesting. What Karl Marx helped us to understand about the history of the human economy and the history of the means of production and economics and civilization and class society is something that all human beings throughout all history have kind of known in their bones. It is a narrative that is very, very much deeply embedded into the human psyche. We human beings seem very, very aware of this narrative. And what's interesting is there's an odd parallel in this narrative to human life. When a baby is born, it can't feed itself, can't take care of itself. It desperately depends on other people. But gradually, the baby becomes more and more independent. And eventually, it becomes an adult and is kicked out of its parents' household, has to go out on its own. But eventually, the human being becomes older and can't take care of themselves and depends on other people once again. And once again, and that you can make a parallel to the life of a human being. This narrative that Marx gives us about human history, going from primitive communism to class society, back once again to the higher stage of communism. That Christianity gives us the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, and human civilization, ultimately leading up to the Battle of Armageddon, and then the restoration of Eden, heaven on earth. Also humans, the baby, dependent on others, not able to survive on its own, growing into adulthood, becoming self-sufficient, and then eventually getting old and deteriorating to the point that they depend on others, and then eventually dying. that this is a narrative that seems well embedded in the human psyche. It's very interesting. It's very interesting that this understanding of where human beings came from before human civilization existed, which was the majority of human existence, was pre-civilization. Something happening, and then we acquire the ability to build a civilization, to have technology. And that creates new levels of productivity and new expansions of the life expectancy, but all kinds of new problems and contradictions. And those contradictions proceed and escalate and get bigger and get more dramatic. And human beings become more connected with each other than ever before. Nations emerge, a global economy emerges. And then finally, the contradictions that emerge because of our human progress get so dramatic and big that they finally get resolved. And then once again, we're back to a state of prosperity and abundance. It's an interesting way of looking at things. Thank you for letting me go down that rabbit hole with you all. I enjoy talking about these kinds of things. You would think that mythology and dialectical and historical materialism would have nothing in common. But actually, they do. There are similarities in the narrative. So the next super chat that I had was, how do we fight against the myth that communism is anti-religion? Well, it's not a myth. I mean, look, Karl Marx was an atheist. Karl Marx did indeed say that religion was the opium of the people. He said it was the heart of a heartless world. Religion was the heart of a heartless world and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. That's the full quotation. It's actually praising religion. He's talking about people using religion to numb their pain and suffering. But ultimately, Marx himself was an atheist, right? He was from a Jewish family. And his family was forced to convert to Lutheranism when he was a child, so his father could have a government job. I believe he was 14 years old when the whole family was basically forced to convert to Lutheranism against their will. And Marx, as a young intellectual, became an atheist. And he fell in with the left Hegelians. Hegel was the very well-known German philosopher. After Hegel's death, I think, there were two schools of Hegelians. Those who interpreted Hegel in a right-wing, conservative, and authoritarian way, and those who interpreted Hegel in a progressive and egalitarian way. And in Paris, you had many people inspired by the French Revolution who called themselves left Hegelians. And Hegel brought forth the notion of the dialectic and the contradiction. Right? The idea that clashes and conflicts are how human history advances. And Marx was, I don't know what that means. Marx was one who was inspired by the left Hegelians, and that's where Karl Marx comes out of. You have to remember that in Europe, right, Marx, the moment that defined Karl Marx's life was the 1848 revolution in Germany. But 1848 was a year in which there were over 200 different uprisings in Europe. 200 different uprisings. 200. That's pretty massive. They called it the Spring of Nations because it was really the spring of 1848 that all over Europe you had armed uprisings taking place. And the demand of these uprisings was the creation of the modern nation state. Right? The idea was that, all of Europe had been feudal. Feudalism existed all over Europe. You had peasants and landlords. You had serfs and commoners and kings. And the people of Europe were tired of it. France had a revolution already. Britain had a revolution already. And in Germany, the peasants rose up. And actually, do you know what song they sang as they rose up? Do you know what the anthem of the 1848 revolution of Germany was? I'm sure they're going to clip this and they'll take this out of context, I'm sure. I don't care. What was the anthem of the 1848 German Revolution? Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. Deutschland, über all das Welt. That was the anthem. That was what the peasants were fighting for, because there was no German nation state. Germany was divided into a whole bunch of feudal principalities. And the peasantry that were oppressed by their landlords, they didn't want to be oppressed anymore. Instead, they wanted one modern nation state, a modern German nation state with an elected government and human rights. And so they went into battle singing, "Germany, Germany, Germany above all else, Germany above all the world." That was their anthem, the German national anthem. The German, national anthem, Deutschland, which is associated with Nazis. After World War II, they changed the words. There's only one verse left, and it doesn't say that anymore. But that anthem that we associate with Nazis and Hitler and German nationalism, that was a progressive anthem at the time. It was a very progressive anthem, because they were fighting for a modern nation state. And Karl Marx was one of those people. And Karl Marx and his buddies, the Communist League, they were in that fighting force. And the Communist League, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, and a few of their buddies, they were marching into battle with their muskets, singing Deutschland, Deutschland über. And Richard Wagner, the anti-Semitic opera composer, he was marching, Deutschland. They were all there, right? And there were people in the 1848 revolution who wanted a democratic republic. And there were people in the 1848 revolution they didn't care about democracy. They were just pan-Germanists. They just wanted all of one Germany to be a nation state. And there were socialists and communists like Karl Marx. And they were trying to overthrow feudalism. And what was the institution that propped up feudalism in Germany and everywhere, France, everywhere? What was the institution that propped up feudalism? You could not have feudalism in Europe without what? The church. The church was the key institution in maintaining the feudal order. In feudalism, everyone is born into their position. If your parents are a peasant, you're a peasant. If your parents are a soldier, if your father's a soldier, you're a soldier. If your father is a lord, you inherit his title. If your father is a king, then you become a prince and then a king. Everyone's born into their place. There's no social mobility in feudalism. Everyone is born into their place. And the way they keep everyone okay with that, because, sure, if you're born into being the king, that's great. If you're born into being a noble, that's great. But if you're born into the peasantry, you might not like that. So the way they enforce it is they say, don't worry, if you stay a good peasant and you always do as you're told, when you die, you'll go to heaven. But if you're one of those people that questions things and you don't obey what the landlord says, then when you die, you're going to go to hell. So you better listen. You better be a good little peasant there. The church was key in propping up feudalism and telling people not to think and getting people to think very silly, superstitious things and making people terrified and subservient was necessary to maintain the feudal order. You can't have feudalism and have everyone think what they want. You can't have feudalism and have, people, all developing their own philosophy for life. In feudalism, you agree with what the church says or you die. You get burned at the stake, right? The king rules over you because he has the divine right, because God put him in charge. You got a problem with that? Well, we can burn you at the stake. That's feudalism. Karl Marx being a revolutionary, the peasants of Germany being revolutionaries, the French people, all the people of Europe that were revolting against feudalism, they did not like the church because the church was the institution that brainwashed everyone to know their place in feudalism. So it makes perfect sense that Karl Marx was anti-religious. I would have been anti-religious if I had existed at that time. If you were a revolutionary in 1848 in Germany, you were anti-religious. That's just a fact. Now, it gets a little weirder because there were also, I shouldn't have said that. In 1848, there were also there were the Anabaptists, okay? You had Marx and others who were secular. Then you also had people that were so religious that they were against the feudal order also. You had the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, the Amish, all come out of a movement called the Anabaptists that existed in Germany. And they thought that the Catholic Church was satanic and they were religious in a kind of anti-establishment way. But at the end of the day, the reason that religion was so hated by the revolutionary movements of Europe was because religion had propped up feudalism. That's why after the French Revolution, they converted all the churches in France to temples of reason. And they beheaded and executed a lot of priests because they saw the church as holding up the feudal order. The church maintained feudalism, and they were breaking apart feudalism, right? That's what was happening at that time. So the fact that, and in Russia too, right? Russia, had been mostly a feudal society at the time of the Russian Revolution. There was capitalism in the urban centers, but overall, you still had the Tsarist autocracy, you still had, peasantry being oppressed, etc. So in Russia also, right? The revolution that happened, the Russian Revolution of 1917, was very anti-religious because religion had been what held up and what propped up the feudal system. Interestingly, the anti-religious current in China did not start with Mao. Did you know this? The anti-religious current in China didn't start with Chairman Mao. Didn't. The anti-religious sentiment in the Chinese Revolution started with it started with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Chinese Revolution. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, his first act, the first thing he ever did, the first revolutionary act that Dr. Sun Yat-sen ever engaged in, the first thing he did was to smash idols. In China, the peasantry were forced to bow before idols. The landlords, the oppressive nobles in Chinese feudalism, one of the ways they would humiliate the peasantry was they would force them to make sacrifices and bow before these idols, these statues. Right? Religion was used in China to oppress people, to prop up feudalism. And the superstitions and the beliefs about spirits and such were used to oppress people. The belief in reincarnation was used to oppress people. The idea was, if you're a peasant, well, that means you must have done something bad in your previous life. So you were born into this. So be a good peasant, and maybe next time you'll be reborn as an emperor or a king. That was used to oppress people. So Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who was the father of the Chinese nationalist movement, the KMT, his first revolutionary act as a young man was to go into a temple where peasants were being forced to bow before idols and smash the idols. Dr. Sun Yat-sen was anti-religious. He was very anti-religious. And he said that idol worship and religion were a humiliation for the Chinese people, that China needed to become modern and needed to cast off. It wasn't Mao and his communism that started the anti-religious current of modern China. It started long before Mao. It started with Sun Yat-sen. So, when people are rising up against feudalism, they are going to be anti-religious because of the role that feudalism or that religion plays in feudalism. That's just how it's going to be. Interestingly enough, there was an anti-religious current in the American Revolution. You wouldn't know this. It's very annoying. When I was a kid, they were constantly telling us the founding fathers were Christians. That's not true. The founding fathers were not Christians, right? Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. George Washington was not a Christian. Ben Franklin was not a Christian. And Thomas Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense, the agitator of the American Revolution, Thomas Paine was definitely not a Christian. He wrote very, very anti-religious books. Look up Thomas Paine. He was definitely not religious at all. And because, again, they were coming out of the Enlightenment. They were fighting against feudalism. They were fighting against old Europe. And so, yes, whenever you have a revolutionary movement that's fighting against feudalism, it's going to be very anti-religious because religion and the role that it plays in feudalism is very, very, very different than the role that religion plays in our modern world. It's very, very different. Now, being religious is voluntary, or it should be. It's not for children, unfortunately, but for adults, being religious is voluntary. Right? You choose to be religious. You can be an atheist, you can be a Christian, you can be a Buddhist. That's not how it has been for most of human history, and it wasn't like that in feudalism. So that is why in the communist revolutions that have happened in the 20th century, there's been an anti-religious character to them, is because they were revolts against feudalism. Okay? But you'll notice that now that feudalism has been overturned in most of the world, Marxism has changed. You'll notice, for example, in the Middle East, Ba'athist Arab socialism embraced Islam. Bashar Assad prays in a mosque. And it's interesting because he's an Alawite. He's not a Sunni, but he prays in a Sunni mosque. Right? Saddam Hussein, he was a Ba'athist Arab socialist. He prayed in a mosque, talked about Islam. Gaddafi, the leader of socialist Libya, was a Muslim. Hugo Chavez was Roman Catholic. Maduro is Roman Catholic. Evo Morales, the leader of socialist Bolivia, met with the Pope, and he gave the Pope a crucifix with a hammer and sickle attached to it. Have you seen this picture? It's beautiful. He gave the Pope a crucifix with a hammer and sickle on it. Evo Morales. In Nicaragua, the Marxist government of Nicaragua, the slogan that they use is socialism, Christianity, and solidarity. That is painted on all the buildings, all the walls in Nicaragua. The Sandinistas, their official slogan of the government is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. Now, in China, the Chinese Communist Party is very much an atheist organization, but they embrace Confucius, and they embrace traditional Chinese culture. And furthermore, they have an association. They have associations of Muslims, associations of Christians, associations of Buddhists that are aligned with the Chinese Communist Party. And in fact, one thing that the Chinese Communist Party is doing right now is it's building Tibetan monasteries. Building them, paying for them. And in the Uyghur regions, they are building mosques and paying for mosques because they know that people in the Uyghur regions are going to practice Islam. They're not going to be able to un-Muslim the people of the Uyghur regions. They're not going to be able to get them to give up Islam. But if they don't find a way that their Islam can be in line with the socialist vision for China, they're going to become Wahhabi terrorists. They're going to become, extremists. The Saudis and the Wahhabis have a big apparatus there. So, in China, the Chinese Communist Party is building and paying for mosques all over the Uyghur regions. There you go. So, I think that the relationship between Marxism and religion is in flux. It is changing. It has changed quite a bit. And that I think those who maintain that communists are atheists, that communists, that the communists want to abolish religion, that communists come into power seeking to persecute those who believe in God. First of all, a lot of that's a little bit overblown, I will say, but bad things went on. I'm not going to deny there weren't atrocities. But that's way out of date. Marxism has changed. In China, in Latin America, in the Middle East, around the world, the relationship between religion and communism has completely changed in the last 50, 60 years. This is not what it once was. In the 1950s, communist atheism and religion were on opposite sides. Now it is no longer like that. And you know what else has changed? And this is kind of fascinating. Atheism has changed. Atheism has also changed, The word atheist comes out of the French Revolution. And atheism was long associated with the left and Marxism and socialism and feminism. It used to be that if someone was an atheist, it generally probably meant that they were sympathetic to communism. If someone was going around saying that there is no God, that religion is a myth, that generally meant that they were somebody who was sympathetic to socialism. They were critical of capitalism. Not anymore. Atheism has changed. Richard Dawkins. Sam Harris. Bill Maher. Those people are not socialists. Those people are not anti-capitalists. Those folks, a lot of them are libertarians. Ayn Rand was an atheist. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Ayn Rand referred to Christianity as, quote, the guilt-peddling Jesus industry. That's what she called it, the guilt-peddling Jesus industry. And the reason that Ayn Rand was against religion is because religion encourages people to be compassionate toward other people. And she opposed all compassion and all empathy. Ayn Rand was against religion because religion built up collectivism and a sense of brotherhood and community. She was against that. She was for the individual above all else. And nowadays, not only do we have all kinds of religious socialists and communists, but furthermore, we have all kinds of capitalist, imperialist atheists. In fact, if you listen to a lot of what the new atheist movement says, I guess they're around, they haven't gone anywhere. A lot of what they say is about building a case to support Israel and building a case to support American imperialism in the Middle East. You listen to a lot of what they say, it all kind of gets down to, first of all, they reduce all the conflicts in the world to just be about religion. The Irish people fighting for their national liberation, this is a stupid religious conflict. If they'd all be atheists, the Irish would never want their national liberation. Malarkey. The Palestinians, they're all just crazy religion. If there was no religion in the Middle East, the Palestinians and the Israelis would get along fine. Malarkey. But that's the way they describe it. All these conflicts that are taking place, it's just people being stupid because of religion. Wrong. The Irish people fighting for their national liberation is not because they're just religious. It's because they want their freedom. The Palestinians fighting against Israel is not because they're just, religious. And no, it's because they want their freedom. Meanwhile, so they say, all these wars around the world are all just caused by people being stupidly religious. So that's the one deception that they put forward. The second deception that the new atheist movement puts forward is then they say, and then Islam is the most evil religion. Islam is the worst. Islam is the most evil religion. And of course, they ignore the fact that Western imperialism propped up Wahhabi Islam, that the most reactionary, barbaric practices done in the name of Islam are propped up by the West. The British Empire created Saudi Arabia, armed the House of Saud, right? Meanwhile, the countries that U.S. imperialism attacks, like Iraq, like Libya, like Syria, like Iran, are the more progressive countries. Iran has women generals in its military. Did you know that? In Saudi Arabia, they just changed the rules so women can drive cars. Iran has different political parties and elections. Saudi Arabia has an absolute autocratic monarch. Everything that Americans think is true about Iran is actually true about Saudi Arabia. The most reactionary, barbaric, primitive regimes that fit this stereotype of Islam that is promoted in American media are the regimes the U.S. imperialists have propped up in Kuwait, and Qatar, and Oman. Meanwhile, it is the regimes like the Ba'athist Arab socialist governments, like the Islamic socialism of Gaddafi, like the Islamic Republic of Iran. Those are the regimes where women have seats in the government, women are in the parliament, where there are religious minorities that are protected. I went to church in downtown Tehran. I went to church. I went to the Armenian Christian church. It was great. They have, can't do that in Saudi Arabia. So the reason, these so-called barbaric practices, the reality of Saudi Arabia and the public beheadings and all the awful things about Saudi Arabia, those things are there because the U.S. imperialists want them there. Meanwhile, the countries that the United States has attacked are all the countries that are trying to modernize and break with those feudal practices. Right? Iraq, secular government. Syria, secular government. Libya, secular government. I mean, if you want to play this game where, the idea is that in the Muslim world people do reactionary barbaric things, that's true. And the reactionary barbaric forces in the Muslim world are the ones propped up and aligned with the US imperialists and with the Israelis. Meanwhile, the people in the Muslim world that are modernizing and trying to get beyond that are the ones that are targeted and attacked by the US imperialists. So, this new atheist narrative that all the conflicts in the Middle East are just caused by people in the Middle East being reactionary and stupid and being too religious, that's wrong too. The new atheist movement is toxic. And it shows that the world is very different. Very, very different. Very, very different. Very different than Wall Street would like you to believe. But things have changed. This isn't the Cold War anymore. This isn't the Cold War. That was way too long of an answer to that question. That's fine. I'm not rushing to get anywhere, right? Restaurants open tomorrow in New York. Fingers crossed. Hopefully going to see a good friend tomorrow. That'll be nice. But here I am. All right. Would you see Lenin on Twitter like AOC? Well, obviously not. AOC, look, I'm not going to get into the game where we start belittling people and, she's saying what she's saying and she can say what she says. But, it's very clear that the victim card is being played. Okay? Now, I'm not going to say anything about how she felt or what she perceived. I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to say, though, that unfortunately we live in an era where victimhood, in the left, in left-wing circles, there is kind of a feeling that if one is a victim, that this is an aspired state of being in, and that's not good. That's not good. But, I would never belittle someone who's been through hardship. I would never try to say that, oh, you didn't really suffer. I don't play that game. I don't play that game. I don't make fun of people who are talking about their own suffering. But I will say that, I was debating somebody on the far right. And I actually said, at one point we started arguing, and they were insisting, oh, no, the government only comes after the far right. And I was pointing out, no, the government comes after the far left. And I said, but this is kind of a pathetic conversation. Why do we win points by being oppressed? Why does everyone want to claim the whole status quo is against them nowadays? That seems to be an aspect of our time, is this, I'm the biggest victim. No, I'm the biggest victim. The Trumpers, they think they're the biggest victims. The left, they think they're the biggest victims. Everyone wants the whole government and everyone to be against them. Why? Right? If you're actually trying to change things, if you're actually trying to exercise power, you would want to have all the government with you. Obviously, if you're opposed to the current status quo, you're opposed to the current order, you don't want them to be embracing you. They would see you as a threat. But this idea that being on the outs, this is not a healthy way of being, right? You shouldn't aspire for others' sympathy, right? Instead, you should aspire for other people's admiration. That's my view, but, as far as specifics about what was said, I don't want to get into that, I really don't want to get into that, and again, who knows? I don't know enough about it, honestly, and, I think we all agree that what happened on Capitol Hill was disgusting. It was disgusting, I'm sorry, but, the way they were conducting themselves, breaking into the offices and destroying property, and, I'm sorry, that was not acceptable behavior. And, I do not condone or support what happened on January 6th, and we can all agree it was wrong, and they shouldn't have done it, and that's that. And I've said that. I do not approve, and I would never encourage anyone to engage in the kind of activities that the Trump supporters engaged in. I would never do it. And it was an example of lawlessness, and it was an embarrassment, and it was a sign of the times that we were living in. There are divisions among our ruling class. So that's really all I want to say about it. Why was Trotsky assassinated? Well, Trotsky was assassinated because he was found guilty in absentia, right? He was charged with a conspiracy against the Soviet Union. The Soviet courts convicted him. He was not in the Soviet Union, so he was then assassinated. There are some people who say that there's no proof that Stalin was in on it, but I've talked to many people. There are many transcripts of meetings where Stalin does call for the KGB to assassinate Trotsky. The guy who killed Trotsky eventually got out of jail, went to Cuba, was treated as a hero in Cuba and eventually sent back to the Soviet Union. So, there's no question that Stalin killed Trotsky in my mind. Now, there's other people who maintain, oh, no, that's all a big lie. I don't think that's true. No, Stalin killed Trotsky. Stalin, let's remember, Trotsky had been found guilty and sentenced to death in absentia in the Soviet Union. And that's why the Soviet Union killed Trotsky. They saw Trotsky as an anti-communist agitator. He was a renegade from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union perceived him as someone who was going around the world trying to turn communists and socialists against the Soviet Union, trying to convince people around the world that might be sympathetic to communism to hate the Soviet Union, they believed he was trying to plan some kind of coup in the Soviet Union to take power. Now, I don't know. I wasn't there, and people dig through the evidence and debate it, and I don't. You asked me why he was killed. He was killed because he was found guilty in the Soviet Union of plotting a coup to overthrow Stalin. And he was found guilty and sentenced to death, and he wasn't there, so the Secret Service took him out. Basically, what the United States does with drone strikes? It's kind of like that, except it was a little bit different because the drone strikes, they don't get a trial. Trotsky had a trial. So, the drone strikes, Obama or Trump, they just sit there and say, okay, and then they kill him. Obama said he prays about it, but there's no legal procedure for the drone strikes. It's straight up assassinations. Well, Trotsky was found guilty in a Soviet court and sentenced to death, and then he was outside of the country, and the sentence was carried out when he was outside of the country. I don't know if Trotsky was guilty or not of what he was charged with. I really just don't know. I think some of the allegations against Trotsky are very clearly, a little bit blown out of proportion. But, was he conspiring against the Soviet Union? Clearly. Was he conspiring to take power in a coup? I don't know. I don't think he had very many allies in the Soviet Union. But I don't really know. So I just don't know. That's that. I don't really know. At the end of the day, Trotsky had led the Red Army. Trotsky, was considered an important figure in the Russian Revolution. Revolutions tend to have contradictions. They tend to have contradictions among them. There are disagreements among revolutionaries. Trotsky wanted permanent revolution, and Stalin wanted socialism in one country. And when it became clear the Soviet Union would not put into practice Trotsky's program of, permanent global revolution, when it became clear that the Soviet Union was not going to function simply as a temporary military holdout in this global fight to seize the entire Western world, when it was clear that the Soviet Union was going to have to operate on the assumption that there was not going to be a socialist revolution in Europe, the Soviet people and the Soviet Communist Party rejected Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution. And Trotsky went into exile, first in Turkey, then in France, and then in Mexico. And in Mexico, he was assassinated, and he was assassinated by people working for the Soviet Union. And the reason that he was assassinated was largely, was primarily, and thank you, Teresa, it was largely because they saw him as trying to weaken the Soviet Union's influence among socialists and communists around the world. Trotsky was going around urging socialists and communists around the world not to support the Soviet Union. And that the Soviet Union saw World War II coming and the German invasion coming. And the Soviet Union thought that was very, very dangerous to have this man who had been a leader of their revolution going around to people who would support the Soviet Union and telling them not to. And, none of this is saying that means he deserved to be killed, okay? So please don't interpret this as me taking a position, right? I don't take a position. I'm not here telling you it was right or wrong. But there are some things that need to be said, okay? Was Trotsky an intellectual? Yes. Was Trotsky a writer? Yes. What did Trotsky write? What did Trotsky write? Trotsky did a lot of writing after he left the USSR. He did a lot of writing and speaking. And some of the things he wrote are pretty indefensible. One thing he wrote is when the Nazis were invading France, Trotsky was neutral. The Communist Party of France was building militias and preparing the French people to fight the Nazis. Trotsky was against that. Trotsky's position, as the Nazis were invading France, was plague on both your houses. He took a revolutionary defeatist position in France. The Nazis were invading France. They were going to France. They were going to round up all the Jews of France and put them in concentration camps, which they did. They were going to set up a pro-fascist state in France. The communists of France are getting resistance cells together. And Trotsky is saying, oh, neither France nor Germany, workers' power, workers revolting against both. That's nuts. That is utterly insane. That is utterly and completely insane. If you're in France in 1939, 1940, and the Nazis are invading, and you're a communist, you're not saying, oh dear, plague on both your houses, the working class has no country. That's undefensible. But that was Trotsky's position. Trotsky, he called for an independent republic of the Ukraine. He called for Ukraine to separate from the Soviet Union. Look it up. He called for Ukraine to separate from the Soviet Union. At a time, there was Stepan Bandera, and there were pro-Nazi separatists in Ukraine who were being armed by the Nazis to fight to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. Trotsky called for separating the Soviet Union from the Ukraine. That's undefensible also. That's completely undefensible. And I noticed the Spartacist League, one of the big Trotskyist groups, actually broke with Trotsky. They said, you know what? Trotsky was wrong on that point. Damn right Trotsky was wrong on that point. Trotsky wanting to separate the Soviet Union, Ukraine from the Soviet Union, Trotsky being neutral as the Nazis are invading France, Trotsky referring to the Mao and his Red Army as a group of vandals and vagrants and saying that the only hope for China was the factory workers and the peasants of China couldn't ever make a revolution because they were illiterate and worthless peasants, the class without a future. Trotsky's hatred for the peasantry of the world, his fixation that peasants are worthless. Mao is leading a revolution of peasants, and Trotsky, denies it and says this is an army of beggars and vandals. Trotsky was wrong on a lot of things. He was wrong on a lot of things. Ultimately, the problem with Trotskyism is this. Lenin wrote a book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. If you read that book, Lenin very clearly said, the book came out in 1914, that the revolutions in the 20th century were not going to happen in the West. They weren't going to happen in France and Britain and the United States, that the revolutionary energy was going to come from the East. It was going to come from countries, South America, Asia, Africa, countries that have been kept poor by imperialism. And that those revolutions would be led by the working class. The working class, the proletariat, would lead those revolutions, but they would be revolutions of whole nations, of whole societies, to break free from imperialism. That was a break with Marx. Marx thought the revolutions would happen in the Western countries first. Lenin says, he writes the book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He says, no. Revolutions, the socialist revolutions in our time, are going to happen in the colonized world. And they're going to happen as revolutions against imperialism, with the working class leading the revolution. Trotsky never really believed that. If you read Trotsky, Trotsky believed that it was in the West that the revolutions were going to happen. Trotsky, he wrote that New York City is the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. Trotsky believed that the West is the best. Trotsky was a Ukrainian Jew, and, he had suffered horrendous anti-Semitism. Trotsky very much was in awe of the Western intelligentsia. He spent almost his entire adult life in London or in New York City or in Vienna, and he was very much a self-hating Ukrainian, a self-hating Russian. He hated peasants, and he hated the East. And if you read his biography of Stalin, he wrote a biography of Stalin. The first page of it has racist stuff about Stalin. It calls Stalin Asiatic. And it says that Stalin was a tyrant because he's Asian. And go read it. Go pull it up. It's on the Marxist Internet Archive. The first page of Trotsky's biography of Stalin rants against Stalin because Stalin is not European, because Stalin is from Georgia, and it starts saying that Stalin is bad because of his race. Because Stalin is not a white European guy. Stalin is an Asian guy. And the Asian people, according to Trotsky, are a bunch of barbarians and they're primitive, but the West is the most advanced. The West is the best. That's Trotsky. Trotsky was Eurocentric. Trotsky was very much a believer that the West is the best. And so when it became clear that there was not going to be a socialist revolution in the West, and the Soviet Union was going to have to function building socialism in the East, Trotsky wanted nothing to do with the Soviet Union. Trotsky did not like that. And his program of permanent revolution was not something that the Soviet people were ever going to accept. That's what's wrong with Trotsky. Ultimately, that's what's wrong with Trotsky. If you want to talk about conspiracies, and I don't know enough about that. I don't know enough about it, right? And I'm not going to say anything, and I'm not going to justify. I am not saying I support killing Trotsky. I'm not going to say that, because that's not what I do, right? I'm just telling you what the difference between Stalin and Trotsky was. I'm telling you what the rationale on the part of Stalin for killing Trotsky was. You asked me why was Trotsky killed, and I just gave you an answer. And that's the truth. That is why the Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders, Stalin in particular, made the decision to kill Trotsky. They saw Trotsky as working to undermine the influence of the Soviet Union among people who might support it and putting the Soviet Union in danger. All righty. Okay, we got quite a few super chats to get through, but that's okay. That's why we're here. All right. Mao organized rural peasants. Does that mean we should organize the rural USA? Yes and no, okay? In the sense that Mao saw that the peasants were the majority of the people of China, and that it was capturing their energy, their revolutionary energy. Whenever people are at odds with the system, whenever there are people that are, at odds with the system, communists should go to them. So if there are, white middle-class people that are at odds with the capitalist system, communists need to find a way to relate to those people, win them to anti-racism, win them to anti-imperialism, win them to socialism. So in that sense, that a revolutionary goes wherever there is energy, wherever there is resistance to the system, in that sense, it's correct. But the class character of the peasantry of China and the class character of the rural population of the United States are completely different. Short video. Yeah. I think that's a subtle dig, but whatever, I'll answer it. Right? The rural population of the United States are proletarians. They're working class people who sell their labor power. We have a few small farmers, but not many anymore. We've never had a peasantry in the United States. We've had small farmers, but really, you can talk about like sharecroppers in the South, but overall, we never really had a firm peasantry in the United States. And now we definitely don't. The rural population of the United States, the rural white people are workers. They sell their labor power. So the class character is completely different. And we don't have feudalism in the countryside of the United States. We have capitalism. And the United States is a fully developed country that is gradually undeveloping, right? We're decaying, but so it doesn't compare in that sense. The only parallel you can make is that Whenever people are at odds with the system, communists should go to them and win them to socialism. The Communist Manifesto, actually, I will quote you exactly what the Communist Manifesto says. Very end of the Communist Manifesto, it says, communists support every uprising against the existing order of things. But in all uprisings, they bring forth the property question. I'm probably butchering that, but you read the end of the Communist Manifesto. It says, communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but in all uprisings, they bring forth the property question. So, listen to that quote. Leftists in the United States, they don't seem to get that. So there's two things here. So first of all, this is the first half. Communists support every uprising against the existing order of things, but